Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Rebecca Ray with the Conference Board, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this month's Human Capital Watch. It's part of our continuing series and focus right now on how human capital professionals are leading the charge in addressing this. And I've had the great good fortune to speak with Mary Lee Hanel of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and length of hats, and today it's my great pleasure to welcome Karen Ganslin, who is the Chief Human Resources Officer at TD Ameritrade. Karen, I'm so pleased to have you with us. Thank you for carving out some time.
You're most welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Well, Karen has a very broad scope of responsibilities, and every industry is different. Every industry, every region, and individual companies are impacted differently. And so I'm so grateful to have a few minutes of time with folks to get a sense of what their journey has been like, the ways in which they have prepared their people to continue to thrive throughout this, and sort of the ways in which they are thinking about the new normal, the next normal, the reimagined workplace, whatever phrase you'd like, what lies ahead. So thank you, Karen, for taking this little journey with me. So a couple of things, we're going to cover, as I said here, not just the TD Ameritrade story, although that is the main focus. I also wanted to share a little bit about some of the resources that are available to you. And so we'll spend a few minutes on that as well, and hopefully you'll find that helpful. It's been a tremendous team effort, and I think across all of Conference Board, we've tried to help from a governance, economic, human capital, public policy perspective, and marketing and communications as well. And so my hope is that a lot of the materials may be of help to you. I want to remind you that you can earn professional continuing education credits here. You'll notice that you need to sign up for whichever one you'd like. You'll see the pod in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. And you'll notice that in one of them for CPE, there'll be an IQ test at several points during the webcast. You'll need to be awake and alert in your chair and hit the button when requested. So I leave that to you to sort. Before we get started on the main topic of today, I just wanted to mention the resources that are available to you and to send you to the human capital portion of the Conference Board. And it's fairly simple. If you download this deck, things are hyperlinked, so hopefully you'll have a chance to go directly to where you'd like to go. And I wanted to just bring to your attention that we have had a special focus on COVID-19, and it is specifically designed to help human capital professionals address this pandemic. So you'll find everything we've got, rapid response, curated resources, webcasts, everything that we have. And we started out with responding to some of our member requests for support, and then we realized, gee, a lot of these requests are very similar. We started just to decide, let's put it all together in a curated hub. That's the first thing we did, was curate all of the assets that we currently had, as well as those third parties with whom we partner and that we trust. And that's what you see when you first land at this particular section for human capital COVID support. We did a rapid response series of crisis publications. There are 10 of them on areas that people told us they particularly needed around certainly looking at layoffs or trying to find alternatives to them, that if you had to, how to be compassionate about it, different choices that folks were going to be making around compensation and benefits, about onboarding and talent acquisition, but certainly there was a lot on employee engagement and the role of leaders during this crisis. Then we moved into helping people think about the ways that they would return to the office, not necessarily return to work, as many people never stopped. And so this was a planner that, and when I put it together, I have no illusions about the right answers, but I was hoping that I got most of the right questions. And this planner was designed to help people have conversations with their colleagues so they could begin to think about what makes sense for them in their organizations right now. And so that's downloadable, customizable, and hopefully of help to folks. And we're now in the midst of thinking about what is the path forward. And so a lot of these reset and recovery publications, you'll see they're hyperlinked if they've already been posted, but you'll see the remaining of the balance of the 10 that we are working on. And I think, you know, there are perennial human capital topics that we always talk about, but I think we tried to look at it solely from the lens through which we need to look at discrimination in the workplace, or compensation choices, or, you know, compassionate layoffs. So hopefully these will be of interest to you as well. And the last thing I'll mention is we just published a brand new report. We reached out to more, we actually have responses from more than 150 executives, and it's really an immediate snapshot. What's going on right now? What are you experiencing? And what do you expect in the short term? And so most people were fairly optimistic about an eventual return. Some people have different feelings about when that would be. I can't say that any of the CHROs with whom I speak are in a rush to get back to a workplace or to try to recreate the way things were. I think they're having very thoughtful conversations with their colleagues about whether or not that's even desirable. Some of the findings I think you'll see here is that there's an anticipation of layoffs in the next few months. There's also some very thoughtful work being done with return to the office or return to the workplace choices that are being made. So I hope you'll find a few minutes to take a look at this report. It is the sum total of your colleagues' responses to a variety of issues. So hopefully you'll find that of interest. So wanted to bring that to your attention, wanted to make sure you know that that's there, and I would hope that you would give us feedback and let us know what else we could be working on to better support you. So without any further ado, let me ask you, Karen, if you might take us through the TD Ameritrade journey on this particular issue. I know that there have been a variety of factors and elements in the preparation for workers in the workplace here, but I'd love you to share with us what's going on and sort of where you are now in the journey.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Rebecca, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody, or good evening. I think just to start, for those of you who may not be aware of what TD Ameritrade does, we are a brokerage and wealth management firm that services over 12 million retail investors and independent registered investment advisors in the United States and in Hong Kong and Singapore, and certainly have seen record engagement and record trading activity with all of the market volatility over the last several months. In terms of the environment we're working in or our situation, I think it's really important for folks to understand that we never really left work. 100% of our workforce is working from home. We've been in a work from home environment since the 21st of March, and it took us about 10 days to accomplish that in order to get everybody out. And it really was an amazing team effort led by our tech, health and safety, risk, HR, and communications teams. And we were fortunate in that on any given day, we already had about 15% of our workforce that was working from home, so it did make it a little bit easier. And we did need to work very closely with our regulators to make sure that our processes were fully compliant with their expectations. As many of you know, financial services and brokerage is a highly regulated industry, so that was not an easy feat. And as I'll talk about a little bit in a minute, our productivity, surprisingly, is the same or better in the midst of, as I mentioned earlier, record trading volumes and client engagement. And we have had several days where we've been doing 4.5 million, and 5 million trades every single day during market hours. So it's just, you know, staggering numbers. As part of this, we also established a process for a small group of employees who we deemed essential. That's a very tightly controlled list. We provide everybody with a letter. We monitor the badge access. And we've got about 1% of our workforce that comes into the office on any given day to perform certain duties that they need to do, pick up the mail, pick up checks, etc. But most of them are not actually in the office for a full day. And I think what's important here is that we really found that our leadership team had to spend a significant amount of time on what a return to office policy would look like. We started off at the beginning of the crisis with daily morning huddles, including weekends, Saturdays, and Sundays. We've now transitioned to once a week. These issues require a lot of thought and debate and collaboration. And it is really quite complicated given it's such a fluid situation. We have a national geographic presence, and new cases are starting to spike up again, which is, adding yet another dynamic. But I think as leaders, we found that you really need to be very resilient, agile, and adaptive in this type of an environment as we learn as we go.
Karen, may I just share with you as we go some of the questions that are starting to come in. So on the previous slide, you talked a little bit about productivity. And I want to pick up on something you said earlier, which was as you made that switch for 100% of your folks being able to work from home, that was possible, or let's say made easier to do because many of your folks were remote, or others had had the opportunity to work remotely, at least from time to time. And that's pretty consistent with the companies that we talk to. I'm somewhat interested to note that there were a lot of companies caught very flat-footed here. I think this was not a scenario planning exercise that played itself out quite the same way. And it really did make a huge difference as to whether or not someone had already embraced, at least on a partial scale, the work from home option. And the question that we have that's just come in is around productivity. And I know, for those of us in this space, we looked at productivity in the work from home setting even before this, right? And so the work from home productivity levels we found to be as high, if not higher, in most cases. We've even found that through this particular crisis, and I think that's against the backdrop of, a lack of child care in many cases, the pressures of elder care, the very base level Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of challenges around, can I get, a bounty towels and toilet paper and food for my family? I mean, these are really tough issues, as well as, will I have a job and, maybe I've been furloughed, or a variety of things. The question is about, how you were able to monitor productivity, and sort of what comfort level did you have that productivity stayed as high? Granted, the number of traits is a real indication.
Yep. So our biggest challenge was actually getting the people on the phones in the contact centers who are on the phones all day with those 12 million clients, getting them the connectivity they needed to be at home. And because we're a highly regulated industry, we actually have to record all of those phone calls. And all of the phone calls that come in do go into the queues. Those are monitored by our workforce management group, and we know exactly how long the wait times are, how long the queues are, and we were able to replicate our call center environment in a work from home environment. And so, we have a lot of productivity metrics in terms of all the things that go with the trading activity in terms of settlement and clearing and RIA requests, etc. So we basically 100% replicated that. We got the regulators comfortable. We're able to record all of the calls. And I think the two things, and I'll talk a little bit about it a bit later in terms of our sentiment survey that we sent out, was one is, I think the non-client facing associates actually found that not having to commute and having sort of less chit chat in the office, there's always the visiting and that sort of thing, made them more productive. And I think, similarly in the call center during tax season and when things were very, very volatile in the market, we actually implemented a mandatory double overtime policy for a minimum of X hours a week for our reps in the contact center. And a lot of that, can be done on email or follow-up. And I think a lot of our folks said, what, rather than having to do that during market open hours, we were actually able to, feed the kids at night, get them settled down, and then I could log in the evening again between 7 and 10, do my overtime, and actually have some quiet time. So I do think it's challenged us a little bit in terms of thinking differently that you can work outside of normal 9 to 5 office hours and really, get your productivity up. Because if you're, interacting or sending a follow-up note to the client, if you do it at 10 o'clock at night, it's going to be sitting there for the client the next morning when they open their email. So I think it's been a bit of a lesson learned for us as well that, we as leaders need to think out of the box here a bit too.
I think most employees rise to the challenge when there's an immediate crisis. And I think most of us try to put, what we can on the table and leave nothing behind in order to continue to deliver, particularly when you're customer facing, in terms of what you do. The question, I think, is,
right.
and perhaps you'll come to this in a few moments, but one thing that's coming up in some of the questions here is, how do we ensure that's sustainable? Okay, I mean, there may be some who return to the office, but there may be others who are, kind of trying to sort out that blurred boundary between work and life. So.
Yep, and again, maybe I'll just address it now a little bit. What we did was we created 2 feedback loops, and we initially did a people manager survey, and then we did an all associate survey, which we just reviewed the results this morning with the team to answer exactly that question. Is a work from home environment sustainable? And I think we've resoundingly gotten feedback from our employees that the answer is yes. Now there are some buts there, right? But it is hard with the kids underfoot, or it is hard with no summer camps. But I think people are generally very appreciative that it's not really the work that's making work from home hard. It's all those other things that happen in their life. And then a few issues around, gee, I wish I had a better ergonomic setup. It'd be great if I had multiple monitors. I'm kind of working from a dining room table and it's not the best setup. But, for the most part, we've been able to confirm with our associates. We sent out the survey. We have 10,000 people. We got 5,300 responses and 2,256 comments. So we are now analyzing all of the comments on all of the yeah buts. It's good, but here's my situation. But those are really the main themes that are evolving around kids and elder care, etc. Good. All right, so then in terms of our approach, my experience over the many years has been that it's always good to start with a agreed upon set of guiding principles, in particular with an issue that can be very emotional and new. And because, people often go right down into the weeds in terms of, how this should work without answering the questions, why are we doing this and what are we trying to accomplish? And so we spent a significant amount of time, hashing out these guiding principles. Now that we're all working from home, when is the point that we might transition back to the office? And we all agreed that our number one priority would be the health and safety of our employees and our clients, and that's our top priority. And this really would be our North Star. We're, obviously going to be governed by facts and science. And we said we would have a very careful balance, making sure that we not only look at our employees, but our clients and the needs of our business on both a national and a geographic basis. So a decision you make in Texas or in Omaha, Nebraska could be very different than a decision that you make in New York City, which is still a hotbed. And we also recognize that there will be exceptions. We will need to continue to be flexible for circumstances as we go back to the office, and that we really need to promote people manager judgment and discretion in leading the transition back, and that people really needed to think about things as guidelines as opposed to rules. So once we got settled on that, we then provided guidance to really reduce the anxiety. There was a lot of emotion around this, and we had to deploy a very comprehensive communication strategy. And some of the key message points that we've put out to our workforce and our leaders, or the actions taken, is, to my earlier point, we said we would have a very location-specific approach, and it would be supported by science and facts. It would need to be supported by a downward trend in cases, and we would also seek guidance from our medical director. We also clearly made it clear that working in the office will change. It will not be like it was before. So things like social distancing, wearing masks, temperature checks, relearning social behaviors in terms of social distancing, and how to behave in common areas, whether it's elevators, kitchens, pantries, cafeterias. These are all things that people need to think about. We said we'd be very flexible to accommodate personal circumstances, whether that's kids, whether that's schooling, or whether there would be family members that had underlying health conditions where we could potentially put those people at risk. We also said we would wait a minimum of 45 days before we return to an office after a jurisdiction reopens so that we could observe trends. And to support that, we also developed a very comprehensive return to office manager toolkit, along with some Q&A guidance, and we really had, two sets of bookends here. We had one set of associates that were saying they were very nervous to say, well, what if you force me back and I'm not ready to come back and I'm very hesitant, to another group of people who are saying, yep, I'm ready to go, I don't care, I'll take the risk, let's get back to work. So we really provided them with some tools there. And as I talked about earlier, we did create the feedback loop in terms of the initial people manager sentiment survey, followed by an all-employee sentiment survey to make sure that is work from home actually sustainable? And other than the things I've talked about already, the answer is yes. But as part of that, we also wanted to make sure that associates were getting the resources they needed. Are they, they have the right tools? Do they have the right technology? But more importantly, are they getting the feedback? Are they getting the coaching from their managers so that they can continue to operate successfully? And then we developed a return to office framework or playbook to guide our actions forward. And so so this slide here is what we've put together, and I would say out of all of my slides, this is really the money slide. And so, our operating assumption here is that we probably can only get to about 25 or 30% of occupancy until there is a vaccine or a cure, in order to allow for social distancing. And so our return to office framework or approach really becomes a series of, or an array of, risk management decisions across several dimensions that we have identified as important for our business as we learn how to live or work with this disease. And certainly, as you can see from all of the various owners on these work streams, it will still require a tremendous amount of collaboration and partnership. And for us, we really said there are four, horizontal areas we need to look at. One is, what do we need to do for our employees? What do we need to do in our offices, in our physical space? What do we need to do to, properly procure and use protective supplies? And then probably the most complicated at the bottom is, how do you do the client interactions in your branch network, where you literally have, associates that are interacting with the general public. And so, there's about 16 different pieces here. The check marks represent where we already have the practices in place, or the controls. The obvious one is the easiest one, rather, is the office environment. But there is a lot of work that needs to be built out from a policy and a training perspective.
On the money slide for a couple minutes here.
Yep.
Questions that are coming in here. So
sure.
So certainly, there's great interest in the playbook that you put together. I would imagine it's very specific to your industry and to your culture and choices that you've made along the way. I wondered if, and Perhaps this is something we can talk offline, but if there's a generic version or some subset of it that may be something to share, I think our attendees would appreciate that. We can certainly talk about what's possible.
Yeah, I think I made this generic already. I mean, there's really nothing, I think, proprietary in here that I wouldn't be, happy sharing that as part of the presentation deck afterwards. So I think that's fine. And, you're right. There are some individual circumstances. I think this is probably most specific or most relevant to a service business. You obviously would need something much more detailed if you were in a supply chain type of situation.
Right. So here comes a few more of the questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there was you alluded to the need for people to sort of relearn social distancing kinds of things in an office setting. Are you doing things physically to alter the office? And if so, what could you share?
Yes, so we're looking at that. So we've, I also run the real estate practice as well. So, for some of you who are on the camera, I'm actually in the office, in an empty office today. We have a very open concept work environment. And so really what we're doing is we're plotting out what those workstations would look like in the various, pods in terms of how they're together. We're using a conservative approach of between 10 and 12 feet and making sure that people aren't directly across from each other, for droplets, and, trying to extrapolate as best as possible what that capacity will be. Now, the devil will be in the details because as you bring people back with various departments, you're going to have to spread them out, on various floors, and then you've got the technology and the telephony issues and those sorts of things. I think our biggest challenge is going to be, how do you operate in in the common areas? How many people can you put in an elevator? We are looking at some of the contact tracing tools. Honestly, from some of the stuff that I've seen, that's not quite ready for prime time yet. We're looking at some heat sensors, so that you don't have queues in the morning as opposed to taking everybody's individual temperature. But again, there's lots of stuff out there. You have to evaluate it. And then you actually have to do the physical construction to actually implement that, right? Like you can't just show up one day with a heat sensor thing in front of all your turnstiles and say, gee, this works. So there's a lot of complexity there. There's plexiglass, there's the social distancing, there's the stickers on the floor, there's all the cleaning supplies or whatever. So I think the real estate teams will know what to do once they get the policy pieces in place and once they understand what pieces of the workforce could come back. Our branches, that's going to be a lot harder, right? How many people can you put in a branch of 6 people? How do you deal with the clients? How long can you be exposed to those clients? At what distance? For how many minutes? Who's actually going to clean those workplace stations afterwards? Is that on my job description? I mean, all these various different things that come up. We have installed lock boxes in our branches so that clients can do drop-offs. So it really is a vast array of lots of physical things that have to happen as well. So, there's probably under the office pieces, there's probably 10 punch list items under every one of those.
Sure. So, I heard your comment earlier that
least.
Every office is going to be a little different, depends on the jurisdiction, and I love the decision that you've made to wait 45 days to see whether or not once something opens, there's a recurrence, there's a spike, there's that sort of thing. There's a question here about whether or not some of the lessons from perhaps your Singapore or Hong Kong offices who were at the early part of the initial wave of this, lessons that they may have learned that you have incorporated into what you may be doing here in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, our offices in Hong Kong and Singapore are very tiny. They're very small. And when we started monitoring travel from Asia, we started that in January. But I think in Hong Kong and in Singapore in particular, the government was very decisive very quickly in terms of the social distancing, and they really we immediately in Singapore and Hong Kong went to the A and the B teams. So half the workforce would come in for the 14 days, and then the other half would come in the next 14 days, and these are to minimize exposure. So I think certainly in Singapore, those were some of the learnings there, that around the A and the B teams, no more than 50%. We had to courier them masks and hand sanitizers, and we've really touch wood, I'm very proud of the health and safety teams. We've had no cross-contamination out of any of this in any of our sites in the United States, in our branches, or in Asia, because we really got ahead of it very, very quickly, and got people out from a level 0 exposure right to a level 4.
These are early days, and you're not fully back, or in many cases, and that's a long process. But I've got a question here from one of our attendees around whether or not this will ultimately reduce your real estate footprint.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. So I think there's a couple things. One is I do think we need to rethink our real estate strategy in terms of density. Because as we've done new build-outs over the last few years, we very much have gotten into hoteling, desk sharing, in particular in our New York locations where there has been a lot of working from home. And that's going to change all of that. So I do think from a real estate perspective, you now need to ask yourself, do you need to have everybody at work all the time? I think, the answer is probably no. And I do think that it is going to, have a lot of businesses, press pause and say, gee, we can work from home really well. Do we need an office tower in Manhattan for these types of roles? Or can you maybe have half the workforce in at some time and half the others, and you just put in cleaning supplies? But I do think there is an opportunity here to maybe shift some of those capital dollars to getting people a little bit better set up in a work from home environment, and less need for real estate going forward. Absolutely. Again, depending on the type of business that you're in.
Whatever percentage, whatever role, however that gets, sorted out. There are implications for those who have to supervise those folks, and let's use leaders in the broadest sense, so that you're responsible for the productivity as well as the well-being of employees. How are you thinking about your leaders and how they need to be, let's say, better coaches or to lead differently, and maybe a particular attention toward the mental health of employees, which has been a much more visible piece of the conversation in this crisis than in past things that I've seen, is a real concern around the mental health of our workers. Would you speak to that?
Yeah, so couple things. One is in our survey, we actually asked the question, how are you adopting from a well-being and health perspective? And we've got about 5% of the population that are saying, it's a little tough. And as part of this, and it was on the path to do regardless of COVID, we did launch a series of mental health tools and resources for our associates. Of course, we have our EAP programs and all the usual types of things. But that is one thing I think as human capital professionals we do need to worry about, because for every introvert there's an extrovert, and so while the introverts are very, very happy and, would say, I'll never come back to the office, half the population are extroverts, and many of us get energy from being with people. And so I think, it's too soon to tell on that. I think we're going to find some kind of a balance in the middle here, because I think people will start to get tired of being from home all of the time, and I think that's something that we have to watch. Now, as part of our leadership and development team, we have actually put together a framework for our managers to say, look, these are all the things you need to think about or consider in a work from home environment, right? How do you manage the extrovert versus the introvert, and getting them to be sensitive? How do you coach remotely when you don't have the luxury of being able to sort of, read the body language or visibly see that, somebody is upset or needs to kind of drop in and talk or whatever. One of the things we've done is we've created quite a few tools in terms of how do you have your morning huddle virtually. We've had a very strong movement afoot in industry in general in terms of going to an agile environment. Agile, Scrum Masters, everybody sitting together. That thing has been turned completely upside down on its side, and so these are all the things that we have to redesign and we have to relearn, and we are putting those tools together, as part of our learning and development team for managers to say, okay, now here's how you do this in this environment. I think one of the worries we have, which is probably going to be the hardest, is how do you do performance management or progressive discipline in a work from home environment? That's a lot harder. Now, you're probably going to have less conflict in the office if people aren't together and maybe don't fight as much. But, it's easy to have a great coaching conversation remotely. I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult in a not so good environment where you do need to have a difficult coaching conversation. I think it's also going to be challenging in an environment where you have salespeople that have productivity goals. That have to go out and solicit and bring new business in the door with clients. So if this continues in the future, I think there's a whole new stream of stuff that needs to be developed on the human capital side that we just really don't know yet. And after 3 months, sure, people are relieved, they're happy, they're appreciative because they're scared. But at what point in time will there be a desire for people to come back and have a little bit more of a normal life and actually, interact with humans again?
Have a set of policies and assumptions. They may not all disappear, but they all need to be reevaluated, I think. Performance management is a perfect example. I think your point about managers is spot on. If we could start with helping managers, leaders, supervisors, use the term you like, but those who are leading the team, if we could teach them to check on people, or to check in with people first and then check in about the work. You know what I mean? It's always people first and then projects after that. But to your point, we have had a pendulum swing. And I would imagine that over time, this will find its own balance. And we'll find people who prefer more remote working versus those who don't. And I'm sure that will sort itself out. The question I have for you is, first of all, those of us who have the privilege of working remote, and I say this knowing that I don't have to make a choice about exposure and my own health risk to make a living, okay? So I'm very conscious of that. But I've also had the luxury of working with people live and in person and right in front of them before we went into this mode. So I know these people. I have relationships with folks, and so going from a 3D environment to a 2D is an experience that a newcomer won't have. So they'll join TD Ameritrade, and they'll have a sense of the culture, but it will be disintermediated by technology. So what thoughts do you have about how do you inculcate new folks into the culture and try to help them understand what's great about this company and the people who work there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, you know, a very real challenge. We are continuing to hire in our call centers. And, you know, I think, to be honest with you, Rebecca, we might, I'm not sure we've completely figured that out yet. You know, we've had to hire people. We've had to figure out how to onboard them. Which you can do mostly from a remote perspective. You can recruit them through video conference. It's a little harder than the in-person interviews. You know, again, part of our challenge is that we require everybody to be fingerprinted. So we do need to actually physically bring them in on the first day, and we've put all those protective procedures in place, and then we need to get them licensed. And you know, the regulators have allowed us to bring those folks in to the physical office and get them licensed. But again, that's going to be a challenge in terms of, you know, for people managers to, how do you onboard a new person that you don't physically see, bring new people in a, as you said, in a 2D versus a 3D environment. And I think we can give people tips and tools how to do that. Some people will naturally be better than that if they are strong on the relationship side. For people who are more analytics and, you know, maybe don't have as strong of, you know, EQ or relationship sides, skills, that could be a problem going forward. So I think, again, as human capital professionals, we have to probably anticipate that's something we're going to have to deal with. You know, so far it's been okay, but we're 3 months in, and, you know, I don't think 3 months doesn't make a trend. I've got a unique set of circumstances in that we're also you know, going to be acquired potentially by Charles Schwab. So now, you know, throw on top of that, you know, a major acquisition where there potentially could be large job loss. And so there is a lot of anxiety and uncertainty right now in the workforce around COVID, an acquisition, a merger. And, you know, I think, again, to my earlier point, you need to be adaptive and agile, you know, and learn as you go, because nobody's had to solve for this just yet.
Dealing with this particular COVID-19 impact also have underlying things that they're dealing with as well. And, you know, in one case, we had Andy Slentz from Hess join us in the last session, and he talked about the oil, the price of an barrel of oil that dropped through the floor. And, you know, so it's a variety of challenges, and it's not a discrete, let's deal with this one and then the next one. It's not linear. I would imagine that communication is a pivotal player in how you help folks be less apprehensive, if that's at all possible, dealing with an impending merger or acquisition, rather, and also this particular pandemic. Could you speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You know, I think, you know, we've got a really rock solid communications team. You know, as the head of HR, I have the pen on the workforce, and in terms of the communications, and, you know, as I said earlier, we spent a lot of time building out those communications and those protocols, from our CEO, from myself, to people managers, to associates, weekly podcasts. I mean, you just have to keep talking and talking and talking about these types of things. And, you know, fortunately, we've got some good new tools, you know, with tools like Slack, where people can collaborate. We've done, you know, a lot of our leaders have weekly virtual town halls where they do an Ask Me Anything type of thing. I do a bi-weekly town hall for half an hour where it's just open floor with questions. You know, we've got virtual happy hours that have been set up by teams where, you know, it's no business. Let's just all get together, you know, various different things there. So, you know, human creativity is pretty powerful in terms of doing it differently. I think it helps, Rebecca, if people know each other. But I do worry a little bit about the new people coming on board. Like, how do you fit into a team if you've never actually met that person in person? So I think, again, those are some of the things none of us have figured out yet, because, you know, this is all so new, right. and you just try to get through the crisis first and foremost.
Now, the path forward, and I know that's, I think, where you're going to take us next, sort of what are the lasting impacts of this? So there's the initial, there's the transition, and sort of, at least for the foreseeable next normal, what does that start to look like? I wondered if you could, kind of take us through your thinking there.
Yeah. So again, we've had a lot of conversations over the last several weeks in terms of what does return to office look like, when lots of different opinions, so I think where we landed as a leadership team, and we're actually communicating it broadly today, is that we have said that we will remain work from home at least until the fall. And I think that'll take some of the pressure off people who are worried about daycare, schools, children, etc. I think it'll also give us a little bit of a better sense as to where we're going in terms of, contact tracing, testing, a vaccine, and whether there's, going to be a second wave. The one area that we potentially could open up a little bit sooner is our branch network. And so, but it won't be all branches, it might be some branches. And there's a subset of our overall leadership team in terms of return to office that are working on the branch stuff. They are actually presenting next week to say, here's what we're thinking. But again, it's going to be very careful. It'll be volunteer. It'll be volunteer-led. We will not let anybody. We will not force anybody back. We've clearly said that this will be voluntary. And so if you have a smaller branch, let's say with 5 people, and you don't get enough volunteers to open up that branch, we've said, well, then we'll stay closed. And we'll just have to figure out how to deal with those clients. So I think for now, working from home at least until the fall. We are going to talk with our potential acquirer. Actually, that meeting is happening today, from a policy framework to make sure that we're somewhat aligned there. That if we get to deal close and communicate something, that we then don't have something completely different occurring. What we have done as part of the control environment, the earlier slide, is we actually have said to businesses, you're going to need to build a business case in order to submitting any location reopening. And we've provided them with a template. Our risk management team is going to assign what they call a risk acceptance severity level to help determine the return to office readiness. So in other words, if you don't have all those 16 things done plus some other things that are geographically specific, you're not going to be allowed to open. But what we've also said is there needs to be an expected business benefit to returning from the office. So you need to actually demonstrate that you're going to get a productivity lift, or you're going to actually need to do this because we have some regulatory controls where the regulators have said, no, you've got to do this in person. But somebody can't just decide arbitrarily, well, I'm going to open this office or I'm going to open this location, because we go back to that guiding principle. The health and safety of our associates and our clients is our North Star. And we've also said that, it requires C-suite majority in order to open a location, and the CEO has veto power. So if our head of sales decides to open a branch, but none of us are comfortable with that from a risk perspective, that would not occur. So, and then of course we've got a lot of work to do to build out the policy and the control environment, all those boxes that don't have check marks yet. And then I think it's very important to understand the training framework that has to support reentry. We have said to our associates that if you volunteer to come back to work, one of the prerequisites will be that you need to take the training in advance on a CBT so that you understand what the requirements are of how you operate in this environment. And I think as people start to learn that and say, oh, gee, if I have to wear a mask all day and I'm on the phone and, I can't interact with my pals at lunch or in the common areas, maybe I don't want to come back to work. And so those are all those things that people need to be aware of beforehand. And then once you train them, then who's going to monitor them, right? How do you train your people managers to make sure that you comply with those regulations, and that I think the compliance is really a coaching conversation, right? I've seen some early language. Well, what if somebody violates the policy? And I said, no, time out. We have to relearn some very some social behaviors here, and it's more of a coaching conversation. Hey, Rebecca, you forgot to pull your mask up when you went to get a cup of coffee, and so there's a lot of work to be done here. If this is going to be an ongoing type of environment, and again, largely led by HR with our health and safety teams, but we will consult with our medical director and our legal counsel as well. So lots of work to do. The good news is, because we've said we're not coming back before September, we do have some time to build this out properly and do all of that work.
Few days on this. But I think we have time to answer two more questions, and there are two that have come in that I'd like to share. So one is, I think, a quicker answer. Folks would benefit, would love to hear a little bit more about some of the elements of the business case. And for example, what are maybe 4 or 5 common things that you ask to be in place? You mentioned one, which was to make a case for increased productivity if you went back to the office. What are some of the other criteria that you're exploring?
Yeah, I think they're more traditional, risk criteria. I've got sort of the template off the top of my head, but I think it's going to be largely around making sure that we've got all the health and safety pieces in place as well, right? Have you seen a downward trend in the cases in a specific geography? And what is the science telling you? Do you potentially have contact tracing? The availability of tests? We very much monitor by geography and zip codes. So yeah, in the aggregate, the city where I live in Omaha might be okay, but we'll look at it by zip code and say, if you're in an area where you've got low case numbers in a zip code, it's probably okay. If you're in a high zip code, no. So those are to really doing, I think, the risk management framework. They're going to really be the guys that are going to do the fact checking, right? To look at all those criteria that we looked at, so that they can get those out of the way, that when we make the decision that's more qualitative around productivity, business rationale, perhaps, what are your clients asking? How hard is it to implement? Do you have enough? We do split teams, right? We would do an A and a B team. Do you even have enough people to volunteer to do an A and a B team, right? And, are people willing, to wear a mask? We spend a lot of time with clients on the phone. Is it reasonable to ask somebody to wear a mask for 8 hours a day? Probably not. If I had to wear my mask for 8 hours a day and be on the phone, I probably couldn't do my job. So, there's a multitude of factors there, but first and foremost, get the science and the medical facts out of the way, so that you can then deal with some of the other elements.
Companies are considering having their employees sign a waiver if they require them to come to the office. I know you've mentioned the sensitive to who might be comfortable or have underlying conditions, or if someone in the home, that sort of thing. But I wondered if you could just speak to that issue for a moment.
Yeah, and I've asked our employment council to look at that in terms of will we require people to sign a waiver? I think that's a bit of a slippery slope, because nobody can guarantee a 100% safe work environment with potential community transmission. So I don't think at this point in time we would ask somebody to sign a legal waiver. But, as part of their volunteer attestation, so if we go back to the prior slide, the very first one, that volunteer attestation and how do we build that out, and how does that look like in a legal framework is something that we need to work through right now. And the teams know that not only our internal employment counsel, but also our external counsel will opine on that to make sure that people are comfortable with that and what the potential risk is there. You know, maybe outside counsel, or when we look at it, may come back and say, yes, you do need somebody to sign a waiver. So that's still a TBD. Our initial thinking is that we probably wouldn't do it. The part I'm more worried about is around the branch network, where we've got the client engagement protocols, right? So a customer comes in and they've been in the conference room, and we've said we'll have to, you know, wipe down, you know, where they sat, etc. Well, who does that, right? And so, you know, it's really easy to assign that job, which arguably is the most risky job, to your lowest person, you know, your greeter, your customer service person. And what are managers, or what are we going to do if somebody says, hold it a minute, you're putting me at risk. Why should I be the person to have to clean up after a client? That's not on my job description, and I don't feel comfortable doing that. So we have gotten an outside legal opinion on that already, that our recommendation would be that that should be a manager responsibility. And again, it's a bit of a mental, you know, paradigm shift here, where the manager may be required, you know, to wipe down, you know, the room afterwards, and that's a very different, you know, shift of thinking. Or I suppose, you know, you could hire, you know, a security guard, or you could hire a full-time janitor to do all that, but that's not always practical from back to that cost-benefit analysis, right? Like if you have to put, you know, all these things in place in a small branch, and it's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars to open up, why don't you just keep working at home?
Karen,
that would be one of the other things that, you know, we would build into the business case. So
I do want to thank you for all that you have shared today, and to helping us be more informed as a community about this very difficult and different choices that we need to make. So thank you so much for choosing to join us today, and I'm in your debt. Well, thank you, Karen. I do want to let our viewers know that next month I have the privilege of meeting with Vice Admiral John Noel. He, as you can see, runs the personnel area for the United States Navy. And when you want to talk about a set of